Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, this spring the government completely walked away from Canada's global commitments on the environment. It cancelled programs already in place to help Canadians make their homes energy efficient. It gutted other environmental programs right, left and centre, Mr. Speaker. And when we asked what they would do to save the environment, we were told to wait. Well, we've waited, Mr. Speaker, and what we got today was nothing less than a national disgrace, Mr. Speaker, a national embarrassment. I asked the Prime Minister, how on earth could they have laboured so long to now tell us there's not one single new action in this decade to stop climate change or reduce air pollution for our citizens in this country?
The Honourable, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Before the Leader of the Opposition has a right to ask questions about the environment, he has to answer a question: why is it that the Liberal record under 13 years was one of unmitigated failure? Why is it, sir, that the putative Liberal leadership candidate of Etobicoke Lakeshore said, quotes, on Kyoto, the Libs never got it? Mr. Speaker, why is it that the member for St. Paul said that we had one smog day in 1993 and 48 last year? Well, Mr. Speaker, that record is not acceptable to us, which is why we've introduced for the first time meaningful, tough regulations on pollutants and greenhouse gas emissions.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it was exactly that sort of baffle-gabbing hot air, Mr. Speaker, that set off the fire alarms in Parliament this week. Environmentalists are telling us this nonsense from the Conservatives is nothing more than a policy made in the USA, like so many other actions of this government. For the next 4 years, Canadians must wait while they do nothing but talk. For the 15 years after that, they let greenhouse gases increase. Climate change gets worse for more than 40 years, Mr. Speaker.
Whoa.
Why is the government violating its responsibility to the environment, our children, and the future of our planet, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
It is incredible, Mr. Speaker, because every single Liberal leadership candidate who has proposed targets for greenhouse gas emissions has proposed that those targets will be met by 2050. The difference is this, Mr. Speaker. We are committing today, for the first time ever, to introduce meaningful, tough regulations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 65% by 2050, as opposed to the commitment by the member for Etobicoke Lakeshore to reduce them by only 50%, Mr. Speaker. We'll do far more than the Liberals ever will.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, this is against all the evidence. Smog harms our children. It contributes to the degradation of our environment. They've killed Kyoto. While the Conservatives are consulting, our planet is dying. Why doesn't the Prime Minister admit that he completely has no regard for the environment? He has no plan today. He won't have one tomorrow, next year, or in 44 years, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, we had 13 years of monumental failure because of the environmental policy of the Liberal government. Today we will take action with the first piece of legislation on air quality in order to introduce regulations that will reduce pollutants, greenhouse gas emissions, because after the Liberals had a 28% increase in these greenhouse gas emissions, today we are making a commitment to reduce them in a concrete way, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Westmount Ville-Marie. Mr. Speaker, what the Conservative minority government announced this morning is simply a disgrace for future generations. It amounts to saying that the government doesn't want to do anything about global warming. There's not one single new measure to counter greenhouse gas emissions that was announced. Why can't the Prime Minister simply admit that he wants to destroy Kyoto and that this bill is simply smoke and mirrors? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, our party, the government that made a mess of Kyoto was the previous Liberal government with 28% increase in greenhouse gas emissions. We took action today with regulations for the auto sector. For the first time, we've proposed new, stricter norms for pollutants in the atmosphere. We took concrete action today, Mr. Speaker. After 13 years of Liberal failure, the Honourable Member for Westmount Ville-Marie. This is really a step backward on the part of the Conservative government. It does not achieve any short-term objectives. It has no new powers for the government to fight climate change. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, the Conservative government is not looking at 2010 or 2030, but 2050. That's almost a half-century away. How can the Prime Minister explain that these government's targets only happen in 44 years? He has no plan to achieve these targets either. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, how can the member explain that the member for Saint-Laurent-Cartierville made a commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 60% by 2050, the member for York Centre by 50% in the next 45 years, Mr. Bob Ray 60% in the next 45 years, the member for Etobicoke Lakeshore 50% in the next 45 years. Today, we made a commitment to reduce them by 65%. The Honourable Member for Laurier-Sainte-Marie. Mr. Speaker, the government has been promising for months now a Made in Canada green plan that would go beyond the Kyoto Protocol. Today, the government tabled a bill that instead of having 4-year consultations before having regulations, the government even has an exit strategy in the bill which would allow it not to respect Kyoto commitments. Will the Prime Minister admit that after 9 months he gave birth to an empty shell, and in that time greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase and will continue to increase until 2010? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I will admit easily that this is the first government that has taken concrete action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to reduce pollutants, to table a bill to improve the quality of our environment with real and strict regulations. We're the first government to regulate emissions in a targeted way, which will allow us to achieve environmental targets, and we are proud of the work of this government. The Honourable Member for Laurier-Sainte-Marie. Mr. Speaker, while it's imperative to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that are responsible for climate change, the population is already subject to the consequences. The government is rejecting the objectives of Kyoto. Will the Prime Minister admit that only the oil companies will benefit from his plan? It's written in Washington. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. No, Mr. Speaker, that's not true. That's ridiculous, Mr. Speaker, because all sectors and all industries in Canada will be affected by the regulations that were announced today in the bill, including the petroleum industry. All industries, all regions of Canada have to play an important role in the work we have to do to reduce emissions, to reduce pollutants, greenhouse gas emissions, to improve the quality of our environment and the health of Canadians. The Honourable Member of Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. The government has confirmed that it has decided to have this intensity approach put forth by the previous government and denounced strongly by the Environment Commissioner. This ill-advised choice will not achieve any significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and may even allow for their increase. Given that the oil companies will double their production in the next 10 years, could the Prime Minister admit that this intensity-based approach simply confirms his complacency toward his friends in the oil industry? The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Order, please. The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our government was very proud today to table Canada's Clean Air Act because and reduce smog. But most importantly, Mr. Speaker, for the first time in Canadian history, we will actually have national air quality objectives, and that will reduce smog, it will reduce cancer, it will reduce chronic bronchitis, and it will reduce childhood asthma. I'd like to ask the member opposite, Mr. Speaker, if he's against those things, and if he's not, I hope he'll support the Clean Air Act.
The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite. Mr. Speaker, I would invite the Minister to read her own bill. This bill makes no reference to Kyoto. It suggests intensity-based reductions that start in 2011. It confirms the government will take no international commitment in the medium and short term. It confirms that the government does not have to respect its Kyoto Protocol commitments. Can the Prime Minister admit that this bill constitutes the death knell of the Kyoto Protocol, which will suit his friends, the oil companies? The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Speaker, I don't know why the Bloc is against clean air and actually introducing for the first time in Canadian history regulations across every industry sector for air pollution and greenhouse gases. And Mr. Speaker, if he's against the Clean Air Act, I guess he's also against setting fuel efficiency standards in the auto sector for the first time in Canadian history. He's against establishing national air quality objectives for the first time in Canadian history. And he's against myself and the Minister of Health actually being accountable to Parliament by reporting on annual progress. I'd like to ask him, Mr. Speaker, Canadians want these things, Quebecers want these things, why doesn't he?
The Honourable Member.
The Honourable Member for Vancouver East. Order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's official. Just like the Liberals, the Conservatives are going to make the air Canadians breathe a whole lot dirtier. Despite what the Minister says, there are no caps on greenhouse gases, there are no targets for the industrial sector, and by the government's own admission, pollution will not go down, it will go up. So can the Prime Minister explain why he just gave his friends in big oil and big industry a 20-year pollution holiday?
The Honourable, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
The Honourable Member is completely wrong. The Honourable Member comes from a party that asked and made a platform commitment for the introduction of a Clean Air Act. I guess they can't take yes for an answer, Mr. Speaker, because today we have for the first time introduced meaningful regulations and a meaningful law that will give the government the power to restrict the emissions of both pollutants and greenhouse gases with a hard target of a 65% reduction. But, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to know what she has against mandatory auto fuel efficiency standards. Is she going to vote against those standards and against the Clean Air Act?
The Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
Mr. Speaker, this act does not make the air better, it makes it worse. And if the Minister thinks that industry is a cheap date, as she said, then why does she give them another 5 years to pick up the check? If the government really believes in regulating industry, then why didn't it have the guts to do it today? Will the Prime Minister admit that the big winner today is the pollution industry, while the losers are Canadians who are tired of being promised hot air when all they get from Liberals and Conservatives is hot air?
The Honourable, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, like on so many issues, the NDP is so blinded by their dogma and ideology they cannot see the facts. And the facts today are that this government, Mr. Speaker, the Liberals introduced the statutory framework for regulation of industry in terms of pollutants 35 years ago, but they never brought those regulations into effect. That's precisely what we have done today. Mr. Speaker, after 13 years of Liberal inaction, today we introduce meaningful industry regulations that will reduce pollutants in our air to protect the health and safety of Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Don Valley West.
The so-called Clean Air Act pretends to deal with air pollution and greenhouse gases by removing them from the toxics section of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. Mr. Speaker, this government has just opened itself up to years of lawsuits because this measure is likely unconstitutional. Apparently no one told the minister that the government only has the undisputed constitutional power to regulate toxic substances if they are clearly labelled toxic. Will the Minister of Justice admit that this process weakens the law and will tie up any real environmental action for years in the courts?
Honourable the Minister of the Environment. Order. The Minister of the Minister of the Environment has the floor. We'll want to hear her answers.
Thank you. In fact, Mr. Speaker, what Canada's Clean Air Act does is enhance the powers that I have as a federal environment minister and enhance the powers that the health minister has. In fact, for the first time in Canadian history, we will be able to regulate indoor air for things like radon, which is the leading cause of lung cancer in non-smokers, Mr. Speaker. And what did the Clean Air Foundation say about that? They said, we are pleased to see that the Clean Air Act will permit for the first time in Canadian history regulations of products that will have impacts on indoor air. That's results for Canadians and protecting the health of Canadians.
Honourable Member for Don Valley West.
I fear the law does not support the minister. In the Hydro-Quebec case, the Supreme Court decided that the federal government needs to label toxic substances toxic in order to regulate them with certainty. This bill removes all air pollutants and greenhouse gases from the list of toxic substances in the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. The government is begging for a lawsuit. Will the minister admit that her real intention is to delay action on climate change for years when she already has the tools she needs to act today?
The Honourable the Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member must have missed the press conference this morning because what we introduced today was a notice of intent to regulate all industry sectors under current legislation, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. All regulations will proceed without Canada's Clean Air Act. What Canada's Clean Air Act will do is it will enhance our powers to do things we can't do right now, like regulate indoor air pollution and regulate biofuels so that we can burn cleaner and greener fuels and give opportunities for farmers. So if he cares about those things, he'll support Canada's Clean Air Act.
The Honourable Member for Honoré-Mercier. Mr. Speaker, the Minister has just put the axe to Kyoto. No short-term objectives, no measurable targets, no compulsory timetable. Her only precise target is 2050. I wonder how old she'll be by then. Will there be any glaciers left in the north? How much land will still be arable? How many coastal cities will be flooded? How many people will die from the direct or indirect consequences of climate change? How can the Minister do this to our planet? And more importantly, how can she do this to our children and our grandchildren? The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, it's precisely why we need Canada's Clean Air Act, to protect our generation and the generations that come after us. I'd like to know how the honourable member could vote against a bill that will make sure for the first time that we can enact interim emergency orders to shut down polluting industries if we think immediate action is needed. How can he vote against something that will expand the inspection powers of our enforcement officers? But most surprising, Mr. Speaker, is how could he actually vote against fuel efficiency standards in the auto sector? You know why, Mr. Speaker? Because they never had the guts to regulate the auto sector.
The Honourable Member for Honoré-Mercier. I will never vote for something so irresponsible, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a few months ago, the Minister announced that she would announce something soon. Since then, she came to the Environment Committee to announce that there'd be an announcement that would announce the announcement of the announcement. The Prime Minister and his ministers confirmed by an announcement that he would soon be announcing an important announcement on the announcement preceding the announcement. Today, they're announcing they're going to consult, Mr. Speaker. They're going to consult for years. We've heard consultation for years. We want action. When's it going to happen anyway? The Honourable
L'Honorable Ministre
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let's talk about regulations that will come into force in the next few weeks and the next few months. Regulations to reduce pollution from big equipment and construction. Regulations to reduce pollution from oak boards and ATVs and snowmobiles, heavy trucks, school buses, forklifts. Reduce pollution from consumer products and things like paints and cosmetics and cleaning products. All of these things have an impact to improve the health of Canadians. That's what Canada's Clean Air Act does. That's what the action we introduced this morning, and that's what this member should support.
Here.
Honourable Member for Chambly-Bordua. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Minister of Industry was bragging about an agreement with the Quebec government about the support program for older workers. That is not the case at all, Mr. Speaker. No fewer than 3 Quebec cabinet ministers, and not junior ones, that is the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Economic Development, and the Minister of Labour, have said they are disappointed with the federal program. What answer can the Minister of Industry tell the Quebec government today? They are asked to provide an income support program for older workers, not just job re-entry programs. Thank the Minister for Industry. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to announce to this House that Quebec is participating in our program. If you didn't read today's papers, Minister Courchaine stated this is a valid program for many workers who are affected by the forestry crisis. So the Quebec government stands behind our program, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Compton-Stanstead. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Labour, Michel Courchaine, also stated, and I quote, excluding Montreal, when you're talking about the apparel industry, when you're talking about women from ethnic groups, there is a problem, end quote. Doesn't the Minister of Industry realize that not only does this program not have income support measures, which is the main problem, but in addition it excludes Quebec City, Gatineau, and Montreal. That is half of Quebec. Nothing less. The Honourable Minister of Industry. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind the Bloc Québécois, in their election campaign in 2000, in their election campaign platform for 2004, in the one for 2006, the Bloc demanded an adaptation program for older workers. Both the Bloc Québécois was ineffective opposition, never obtained such a program, and never successfully defended the interests of Quebec. It did not deliver the goods. The Liberals didn't deliver the goods either. It took a Conservative government to take charge of things, and it takes a Conservative government to defend the interests of Quebec, Mr. Speaker.
The Member for Marc-Aurèle-Fortin. Mr. Speaker, unanimously the National Assembly of Quebec called for the firearms registry to be maintained fully. How can the Minister of Public Safety ignore the demands of parents and friends and family of the victims of the Dawson College tragedy and the unanimous resolution of the National Assembly of Quebec, and by excluding hunting weapons from the firearms registry, which would basically make it pointless? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, we're going to maintain a registration system for all people who wish to purchase a firearm. And also, Mr. Speaker, for the police, they still have in their system, they have the information there which will show them whether in any given home or house, if there's a man or a woman there who owns a firearm. We're going to maintain that system, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Marc-Aurèle-Fortin. This government has a serious consistency problem. More people in prison, more weapons in circulation. Why does this government always copy the worst of the U.S.? The U.S. incarcerates 7 times higher than here, and there are many more weapons in circulation. The result, there's 3 times a greater chance than in Canada of being a murder victim. More people in prison, more weapons in circulation. The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker. If we have a crime problem on one hand, on the other hand, he's saying that we have a problem because prisoners are still in prison. Mr. Speaker, we're going to keep jailed people who are dangerous, and the Bloc's against that approach, Mr. Speaker. We want to have rules that are safe for our families, for our children, for our men and women, and perhaps they're against that too. The Honourable Member for Laval-les-Îles. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Minister of Industry assured us that the government of Quebec was more than happy with the so-called income support program for older workers. However, the Minister of Employment and Social Solidarity in Quebec, Ms. Michelle Courchaine, said very clearly and very publicly that that was not the case. Because how can one be satisfied with a program to help textile workers actually excludes the region where those jobs exist? Can the Minister explain that to us? The Honourable Industry Minister. Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, Minister Courchaine said that we had developed a valid program for a good number of workers in the forestry industry, but she's not the only one, Mr. Speaker, because the President of the Confederation of National Unions, Ms. Claudette Carbonneau, said that the program was legitimate, with legitimate measures to retrain workers, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Laval-les-Îles. Well, I'd like to know what the forestry industry has to do with the textile industry in Greater Montreal. I think the Minister's reading his piece of paper without thinking about his answer. We can see that the communication with the minority conservative government and the Quebec government is so poor. The critical mass of the textile industry is in the Montreal area. It includes older workers and women from cultural communities in large numbers. Why is the government abandoning those women from the cultural communities? The Honourable Industry Minister. Mr. Speaker, we take to heart the situation of women textile workers as we're concerned about men in the textile industry. It's a very flexible program. It shows the open federalism of this government, and the government of Quebec will decide what the criteria are under that program, Mr. Speaker. But the program will be adjusted to the needs of Quebec, Mr. Speaker.
Brampton Springdale.
Monsieur President, the Human and this Prime Minister seem to always speak with one mind when it comes to muzzling voices of those who are in dissent. They have written off the youth, they have given up on older workers, they have cancelled Canada's volunteerism initiative, which impacts thousands of volunteer organizations across the country. They have even abandoned adults who want to be able to learn to read and write. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives continue to attack the most vulnerable in our society. Does this minister not realize that her cuts are forcing thousands of literacy organizations to close their doors?
The Honourable, the President of the Treasury Board.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're looking at all government expenditures to ensure that they're achieving the results that they intended to. It's something that's tremendously important. Rather than put funds in to have conferences and symposiums, rather than put funds to have advocacy, which was so popular among the previous governments, we want to focus on something unique. We want to focus on actually helping people learn to read and write.
The Honourable Member for Brampton Springdale.
Mr. Speaker, the only thing that the Conservatives are focusing on is attacking the most vulnerable in this country. The facts are clear. These budget cuts by this Conservative government have gutted funding for adult literacy and training programs across this country. The axe has fallen, Mr. Speaker, without any consultation, without any consideration, and without any compassion. This Prime Minister has indicated, not only to his entire caucus, but to Canadians across this country, that it is his way or the highway. Mr. Speaker, why is this government so determined to muzzle, to gag, and to silence the most vulnerable?
The Honourable, the President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to tell you, when the Liberal Party was in government, the most vulnerable in society were taxpayers, Speaker. We saw the billion-dollar boondoggle at HRDC. We saw another billion-dollar boondoggle when it came to the long gun registry. And we saw literally millions of dollars misspent, misdirected, some of even into the coffers of the Liberal Party, Mr. Speaker.
Order. The honourable member for Chatham, Kent.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a few weeks ago, the opposition Liberals were smearing the reputations of public servants and members of the Prime Minister's staff, accusing them of having deliberately broken the law by leaking the names of access to information requesters. But an inquiry into the matter by the Access of Information, Privacy and Ethics Commission has revealed that no laws were violated and no names were leaked. Will the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister demand an apology from the official opposition for having recklessly smeared the reputations of public servants and misleading Canadians?
The Honourable, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
I thank the Honourable Member for the tough question, Mr. Speaker. And let me say that I thought it was shameful that we had several members of the Liberal opposition drag through the mud the names of honourable public servants of this country and people who work in the Prime Minister's office who they claimed deliberately and willfully violated the law and violated the Privacy Act. We now know, after a standing committee inquiry, that those allegations were completely invented, totally fabricated, completely false. Even the Liberal member for Willowdale said, I haven't heard anything to indicate that there was a breach of the law in this matter, Mr. Speaker. We're looking forward to an apology to our public servants.
The Honourable Member for Skeena, Paltry Valley. Order, please.
Mr. Speaker, the Washington-made Conservative plan is great for oil companies, which will be able to continue polluting. With intensity-based targets, pollution won't go down, it will actually go up. Can the Minister explain where she got her inspiration? Was it George Bush, Ralph Klein, or the last Liberal government, which completely failed? The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, the member has his facts wrong. First of all, we regulate greenhouse gases in this country, which is what we announced this morning. The United States does not, from a national perspective. And again, Mr. Speaker, the member knows full well that every industry sector across this country will be regulated with hard caps on pollution, including the oil sector.
The Honourable Member for Skeena, Balcony Valley.
Mr. Speaker, the message from this government is simple. Tell Canadians to hold their breath for 5 years while they figure themselves out. This government said it had a plan, it doesn't. Said it would reduce pollution, it won't. Said there would be targets and timelines, there aren't. Said it would regulate, but isn't. Will the Minister admit that this plan is an absolute failure and that she lied to this House and to Canadians?
That question is out of order. The Honourable Member for Wascana.
Mr. Speaker, municipal governments across Canada are worried that their local decisions and their local contracting will now be second-guessed and manipulated by this meddlesome minority Conservative government for totally partisan reasons, for the sole vindictive purpose of inflicting personal political abuse. It's not just the cities of Toronto or Ottawa. The worry is nationwide. Is it the policy of the government that every municipal contract, including those to which the Government of Canada is not a contracting party, are subject to the partisan whims of the President of the Treasury Board?
The President of the Treasury Board.
The quick answer to that question is no, Mr. Speaker. I can tell the member for Wascana, at least our budget isn't subject to the whims of the New Democratic Party.
The member for Wascana. Order. We don't want to waste time. The Honourable Member for Wascana has another question. Everyone wants to hear it. We'll hear it now.
Mr. Speaker, I would remind the Honourable Gentleman that it wasn't us, but them, that implemented the NDP proposals. Mr. Speaker, the Minister bellows and he blusters, he rants and he raves, but he just fails to offer any proper justification for his interference. He demands access to contracts to which he is not a party. He violates confidentiality agreements. He uses the federal purse to bully and blackmail local authorities. He uses his office to advance his own partisan interests. Is this just a local, personal vendetta in Ottawa, or does his venom extend to every municipality in Canada?
The Honorable the President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, another day and another gift from the member for Wascana. The member for Wascana has the nerve to stand in this place in this House and talk about breaking confidentiality, Mr. Speaker. I remind the member opposite about the income trust scandal, Mr. Speaker, where literally tens and tens of thousands of hard-working senior citizens, Mr. Speaker, lost millions of dollars because of the blabbermouth of the member for Wascana.
Order. The Honourable Member... Order. The Honourable Member for Malpeque now has the floor, and we'll have a little order, please.
That minister, Mr. Speaker, is subject to wild whims affection. This minister, on the other hand, this minister stated it would be inappropriate for grain companies to be part of the discussions for undermining the Canadian Wheat Board. However, on September 18th, he wrote Agricor, a grain company, stating, quote, "I appreciate your comments, which will be very useful as we move towards implementation of marketing choice." Now a director of that company is calling on key board officials to resign. Why?
The Honourable Member's time has expired. The Honourable the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Why? Why didn't he ask me a question? Mr. Speaker. And since he didn't ask me a question, Mr. Speaker, I guess I'll ask him one in response. Why? Why does he want only Western Canadian farmers to have to be subject to the Canadian Wheat Board Act? Why does he ask for Prince Edward Island farmers to be included, for Ontario farmers, for BC farmers? The reason, Mr. Speaker, he wants to make decisions on behalf of Western Canadian wheat farmers. We say it's time they had marketing choice.
Order. The Honourable Member from Malpeque.
This minister hasn't answered a question since January was last, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter, why is this minister involved in collusion with the grain companies as opposed to supporting primary producers? And I might add, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister promised cost of production in this House and during the election. This minister last Thursday contradicted the Prime Minister and stated cost of production is too expensive. Will the minister now support the Prime Minister and go to cost of production?
The Honourable the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think there was a couple of questions in there, and on the first one, of course, I'm just repeat what I've always said. Of course, we're listening to grain handling companies, to Western Canadian grain farmers, to the entire industry, Mr. Speaker, which, by the way, has not had a profitable year since the Liberals were in power in 1993. But, Mr. Speaker, as far as cost of production is concerned, Mr. Speaker, we continue to work day and night and day, Mr. Speaker, to try to fix the program that this government brought in. That case program, Mr. Speaker, was flawed from the start. We're going to replace it.
The Honourable Member for Papineau. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Canadian Heritage answered with a categorical no when asked if dance and theatre groups would be cut back. But the groups are telling us the opposite. They say that they have experienced cutbacks. Will the Minister of Foreign Affairs tell us whether, yes or no, troops have been cut back? The Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Obviously, we are involved in this with 36 other countries. This is a deployment of troops that is involved in interesting and important work to provide security for the development, for the important work that is undertaken. And if the member wants to be a little bit more specific, perhaps she could provide us with that information.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Lambert. Mr. Speaker, we're not talking about military troops here. We're talking about theatre and dance and musical groups. So I'll ask the question again, Mr. Speaker. Yes or no? Have the funding cuts to the Open Diplomacy Fund, are they going to affect international tours for these dance, music, and theatre troupes? The Honourable Minister of Canadian Heritage.
Mr. Speaker, I want to make sure, because yesterday this same member asked a question with inaccurate information. Again, I say that dance troupes and performing troupes will continue to be able to tour. Yesterday this member talked to me about museums that were going to have their funding affected. I asked him to give me the name of the museum affected. He yet has to do that, Mr. Speaker. We are going to make sure that our cultural communities do enjoy our support.
Support all the troops. Honourable Member for Esquimalt, Wanda Fuka.
Mr. Speaker, this question will go to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Speaker, as we speak at the United Nations right now, there's an international treaty to ban and stem the proliferation of small arms and light weapons. Mr. Speaker, small arms and light weapons kill more than 150,000 people a year. However, 100 countries support the establishment of this treaty. Right now, this government has removed Canada from supporting the Small Arms and Light Arms Treaty. Why, Mr. Speaker, has this new Conservative government removed Canada from supporting the establishment of a treaty to curb
the Honourable the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honourable Member from Esquimalt, Wanda Fuka, for his question and also his interest, his passion on this file. Fact of the matter is, he's incorrect. He's factually incorrect. We have not withdrawn support for this. This is something that we have involved ourselves in for some period of time. We've supported British efforts in this regard. It's ongoing at the United Nations as we speak, and we will be engaging and we will be making our position known in the days ahead.
The Honourable Member for Cambridge.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. On Tuesday, students and teachers at Southwood Secondary School in my riding had a handgun scare which necessitated a code red alert. Thankfully, no one was physically hurt. I commend Southwood staff and students and our police for the quick response and for having an emergency plan in place that worked. Since the election, Canada's new government has tabled 8 new bills to tackle crime. Can the Minister of Justice please tell me what the public reaction has been to these initiatives?
The Honourable the Minister of Justice.
I want to thank the member for his excellent question. Earlier this week, when talking about the Dangerous Offender Bill, BC's Liberal Solicitor General said it's high time this change was made. On the subject of reverse onus, according to the Toronto Star, during the election, the member from Mount Royal said he had no doubt such a provision in the criminal code relating to bail for weapon offences would pass a challenge under the Charter of Rights. The honourable member from Toronto Danforth said during the election, if you've committed a crime or been carrying a gun, you've been charged, you should have to show why you shouldn't be kept locked up from that moment on time.
The Honourable Member for London Fanshawe.
Mr. Speaker, since the Liberals abolished Canada's national affordable housing strategy over a decade ago, homelessness in this country has skyrocketed. Canada has a national housing crisis and the time for action has long passed. Will the government update this House on the status of the implementation of a motion adopted by the Human Resources Committee to fully commit funding and immediately flow funds for the National Homelessness Initiative and its 6 programs?
The Honourable the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Human Resources and Skills Development.
We have absolutely no cuts to funding on the Skippy program, and I believe that is what the member is actually asking. We are consulting with the stakeholders on the best practices with regards to homelessness programs and informed decisions and how we're going to proceed. So, Mr. Speaker, we are a responsible government and we will ensure that projects are provided value for the money. And to do that, we need to take necessary times to review projects thoroughly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for London Fanshawe.
Mr. Speaker, the time for consultation and inaction is over. Why is this government ignoring the dire need for affordable housing in this country? Among advocacy groups, there is a unanimous support for the continuation of the Skippy program. This program is essential. If the government can't tell us it's prepared to listen to this House on the much-needed new initiatives, will it tell the housing community if Skippy is being renewed, or is it already on the chopping block?
Honourable, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Social Development.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, as I will repeat again, there have been absolutely no cuts to the funding for Skippy. In addition to extended funding for 1 year this spring, our government made an additional $37 million available to 2005-06 programming just over a month ago. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Esquimalt-Juan-de-Fuca.
Mr. Speaker, there is no time on Canada supporting or not supporting the international establishment of an arms trade treaty. That's the point. The vote comes up next week at the United Nations. Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Minister for Foreign Affairs. The vote is next week. 100 countries have supported this establishment of this treaty. Canada is not on that list. Will he support this treaty, yes or no? Or is his government going to cower under the gun manufacturers' lobby and say no?
The Honourable the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the reality is there is time because the decision will be taken in due course. We have until next week. We have a motion that was tabled, and the honourable member is aware, that came from the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs. We are looking at this, of course, in conjunction with other information provided by the UK, and we are very interested, of course, in having a trade treaty in place that will ban the trafficking in illicit arms that would go to conflict areas of which we're all very aware, including those in Africa, of which the member is obviously very concerned, as are we. And it will happen in due course, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Avalon.
Mr. Speaker, earlier this month, Liberal Senator Colin Kenny called for the closure of Canada Force